The sound that finally broke the town of promise was not the church bell or the blacksmith's hammer, but the rustle and scratch of a million tiny claws. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across a frozen pond, a sound that got into the walls and under the floorboards, a sound that whispered of starvation in a town built on abundance. They stood before her gate that evening, a delegation of the desperate, their faces pale and pinched in the lantern light. Silas Croft, the grain merchant, stood at their head, his usual smooth confidence curdled into a tight mask of false concern. Behind him were the farmers whose boasts had been the loudest, the wives whose pity had been the sharpest. Their granaries were empty, their larders fouled. Their pride was a hollow gourd, scraped clean by the teeth of the plague. They had come to the one person they had all agreed was cursed, the woman with the ghost birds and the worthless land. They had come to Alara. She stood on her porch, still and silent, her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn apron. She did not speak. She simply listened to the sound of their ruin, a sound her own barns had never known. It was not a sound of triumph. It was the sound of a truth finally being told. 2 springs earlier, it had been a different story. Alara arrived in promise on a wagon piled with little more than a bedroll, a crate of books, and the deed to her father's folly. The town had called it that for 20 years, the Jansen place, a quarter section of hardpan clay that had broken the spirit of a man who knew more about ledgers than loam. Alara, his only child, had inherited his quiet stubbornness and his debt. She was 22, with hands too soft for a plow and eyes that saw things the town had long since decided weren't worth looking at. Silas Croft was the first to greet her, his hand offered not in welcome, but in appraisal. He ran the town granary, and by extension, the town's economy. "Miss Jansen," he'd said, his voice slick as oil. "A tragedy, your father. But this land, a young woman alone could not hope to make it pay. I'd be willing to take it off your hands. Settle the debt. Give you enough for a ticket back east." Alara looked from his manicured fingers to the cracked earth of her inheritance. "I think I'll stay," she said, her voice plain and steady. The town's verdict was swift and merciless. She was a fool, a stubborn girl playing at being a farmer. They watched as she bought seeds she couldn't afford, as she walked the perimeter of her land day after day, her boots kicking up clouds of useless dust. The mockery was dressed as concern. "That ground won't grow nothing but heartache, child," said one farmer, leaning on the fence of his own lush pasture. "You'd have done better to sell," clucked a woman at the general store, her basket overflowing. Alara met it all with a stillness that they took for ignorance. She did not argue. She did not explain. She just worked, rising before the sun to mend the fences and clear the stones from a small patch of land near the creek. The heart of the mockery, however, was the silo. It was a great, crumbling stone cylinder at the edge of her property, its roof long since collapsed. It wasn't empty. It was home to 53 barn owls. They were a silent, spectral flock, their heart-shaped faces peering down from the rafters like a jury of ghosts. At dusk, they would pour from the broken roof like smoke, a silent, swirling exodus into the twilight. The town saw them as a curse. Ghost birds, they whispered. Heralds of death, they were an emblem of the farm's decay, a final, feathered monument to failure. When Croft saw that she hadn't driven them out, he'd laughed. "Keeping the vermin, are you? Well, I suppose every ruin needs its ghosts." Alara had just watched him, her expression unreadable. She had already begun to count them. 53. It was the first entry in a new ledger, the beginning of a different kind of arithmetic. Her only neighbor was Mrs. Anya Petrova, an old woman who had come from a country of harsh winters and hard truths. Her own small plot was a miracle of efficiency, all raised beds and trellised vines. She moved slowly, but with a purpose that made younger men look clumsy. One evening, she found Alara standing by the silo, watching the owls emerge. The town children sometimes threw rocks at them. Alara had chased them off that afternoon. Mrs. Petrova stood beside her, her hands smelling of dill and dark earth. For a long time, neither spoke. Then the old woman gestured with her chin toward the silent flock. "The town says they are bad luck," she said, her accent a soft, melodic burr. "The town says many things," Alara replied, her eyes tracking a pale owl as it banked against the bruised twilight sky. "They say a good field is green. They say a full silo is loud with grain. They do not see what is here. Mrs. Petrova nodded slowly, a deep and ancient understanding in her gaze. She reached out and patted Alara's arm with a hand as wrinkled and strong as a root. A thing is not what it looks like, child, she said, the words landing like carefully planted seeds. A thing is what it does. The words settled in Alara's mind and took hold. A thing is what it does. The next morning, she did not go to the fields. She went to the silo. The air inside was cool and musty, smelling of stone and feathers and the dry, chalky scent of decay. The floor was a thick carpet of droppings and small, furred pellets the size of a child's thumb. This was the source of the town's disgust, the proof of the owl's filth. Alara knelt. She had read of this in one of her father's forgotten books, a dusty volume on animal husbandry. With a stick, she gently broke one of the pellets apart. Inside, pristine and white, were the tiny, intricate bones of a mouse skeleton. A skull no bigger than her thumbnail, a spine as delicate as a blade of grass. She broke open another and another. Each one was a perfect little tomb. Each one was a record, a receipt. She spent the rest of the day building a ramp and hauling a wheelbarrow up into the silo's main chamber. She shoveled the filth, the treasure, into burlap sacks. It was backbreaking, dusty work. Anyone watching would have seen a madwoman bagging up rot. But Alara was not bagging rot. She was harvesting data. She hauled the sacks to the empty barn and began the real work. She set up a long trestle table, lit a lantern, and started the arithmetic. That night, and for many nights after, she sat and dissected the pellets, sorting the tiny bones into piles on a clean pine board. Skulls went in one pile, jawbones in another. She counted. She made notes in her ledger. Voles, mice, shrews, the occasional gopher. The numbers were staggering. She calculated the average number of pellets per owl per day. She multiplied it by 53. She multiplied that by 7 days a week, by 4 weeks a month. The arithmetic wasn't about the past. It was about the future. It was the quiet economy of her farm, the one nobody else could see. A thing is what it does. And what her 53 ghost birds did was hunt. They were not a curse. They were a silent, feathered army. The work settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. In the mornings, Alara toiled in her small field by the creek, the clay soil slowly yielding to her persistence. She had amended it with compost and river silt until it was dark and workable. She planted a hard winter wheat, a variety known for its resilience, not its yield. The rest of her time was spent on the owls. She called them the flock, and in the privacy of her own mind, she began to name them. The big female with the speckled chest was General. The young, clumsy one was Tumbler. The silent one who always watched her from the highest rafter was Judge. It was a child's game, but it kept the loneliness at bay. The real child arrived in June. His name was Finn, a scrawny boy of 10 with patched trousers and a perpetual smudge of dirt on his nose. He was one of the town's overlooked children, too quiet for the rough games, too dreamy for chores. He didn't come to throw rocks. He came to watch. He would sit on the fence line for hours, utterly still, tracking the owl's flight. Alara watched him for a week before she spoke. "They don't like to be stared at," she said one evening, walking over to him. Finn flinched, ready to be chased off. "I'm not staring," he whispered. "I'm watching." There was a difference. Alara knew it well. "What do you see?" she asked. "They fly without making a sound," he said, his eyes wide with wonder. "How do they do that?" It was the first question anyone had asked her about the owls that wasn't laced with fear or scorn. She found herself explaining the soft, comb-like edges of their primary feathers, how they broke up the turbulence of the air. She told him what she'd learned from her father's book. Finn listened, rapt. The next day he was back, and the day after. He started helping, his small hands surprisingly deft. He would gather pellets from the base of the silo, his fear of the ghosts replaced by a fierce, protective curiosity. He helped her with the sorting, his sharp eyes spotting the tiny chipmunk skulls that she sometimes missed. "This one got a gopher," he'd announce, holding up a pellet with a larger set of incisors. He became the keeper of the names, adding his own. Patches, Sootface, Ghost. The work was no longer lonely. The mockery from the town continued, but it felt more distant now. They saw the girl and the boy playing in filth and shook their heads. "A shame," they'd say. "She's addled, and she's taking that poor boy down with her." They did not see the ledger filling up with numbers, the neat columns that charted the health of the land. Alara's field, small as it was thriving. There were no tracks in the soft earth around the stalks, no nibbled leaves, no burrows. Her patch of earth was a small, clean island in a slowly rising tide. That summer was wet and warm, the perfect conditions for breeding. For the mice. The town's fields were lush, the wheat growing tall and heavy-headed. The farmers were jubilant. It was going to be a record harvest. Silas Croft was insufferable, holding court at the general store, predicting a boom that would make them all rich. "Biggest yield this valley has ever seen," he declared, clapping men on the back. "We'll be shipping grain to the capital by Christmas." Alara and Finn saw the other signs. The flicker of movement in the long grass at the edge of the road. The unusual number of mice darting across the tracks in the evening. In the owl pellets, the skulls were smaller, more numerous. The mice were breeding faster, younger. The owls were gorging themselves, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a cup. The arithmetic was changing. The numbers were growing. Alara started reinforcing the floorboards of her own small granary, a shed barely big enough for her meager harvest. She sealed every crack with pitch. Finn helped her, his face serious with the importance of the task. "Why are we doing this, Alara?" he asked. "Because," she said, pressing a line of tar into a seam, "it's better to have a small, safe harvest than a large, stolen one." August arrived like the open door of a furnace, baking the valley. The wheat turned to gold, the heavy heads drooping, ready for the scythe. The town of Promise was flush with the giddiness of impending wealth. The harvest was a frenzy of activity, wagons groaning under the weight of the cut wheat, piling it high outside the town granary. Croft's men worked day and night, tallying the bushels, their chalk marks on the slate a testament to the boom. Alara's harvest was a quiet, 2-day affair. She and Finn worked with hand scythes, cutting the stalks with care. Her yield was pitiful compared to her neighbors. It filled her small, sealed granary, but with little to spare. When she brought her wagon to the mill to have it threshed, the miller laughed. "That's it, girl. Old man Hemlock spilled more than that on his way here. Alara just paid him for his time and loaded her clean, threshed grain into new burlap sacks." She counted them twice. 42 sacks. Enough to see her and Finn's family through the winter, with a little left over to sell for seed. She stacked them tight in her sealed shed, the door barred and locked. She kept one sack for herself and gave one to Finn's mother, a quiet, worried woman who accepted it with a gratitude that felt like an apology. The town stored its wealth in Croft's enormous granary. It was the symbol of their security, a fortress of wood and confidence. But it was an old building, full of cracks and gaps, and it was filled to the rafters with a singular, irresistible temptation. The plague did not announce itself. It seeped in. At first, it was just a few more mice than usual. Then it was the smell, a sour, musty odor that clung to the air around the granary. Then it was the sound that Alara and Finn had been predicting in their ledger for months. A soft, constant rustling. Croft dismissed it. "Always a few mice after a harvest," he said breezily. "The cats will handle it." But the cats were overwhelmed, and the rustling grew louder. It became a living sound, the sound of a million tiny heartbeats, a million tiny teeth. The warm autumn meant another breeding cycle. And another. The population exploded, a geometric progression of hunger. By the 3rd week of October, the sound from the granary was no longer a rustle. It was a roar. A dry, seething, scratching roar. Panic began to set in. A farmer went to retrieve a portion of his grain and found his sacks were light, riddled with holes, the contents fouled with droppings. The story spread like fire in a dry field. A committee went to confront Croft. When they unbarred the main door, the scene was one out of a nightmare. The mountain of grain sacks was visibly moving, a writhing carpet of gray fur. The air was thick with the stench of ammonia and decay. The floor was a living tide of mice, pouring from the sacks, from the walls, from the very foundations of the building. The town's wealth, its record harvest, its entire winter security, was being devoured from the inside out. It was a hollow mountain, a whited sepulchre full of corruption and ruin. Croft's face was the color of ash. His boom had become a bust. His fortress was a tomb. The sound of promise was no longer the blacksmith's hammer. It was the sound of chewing. The first frost came, and with it, the first real bite of fear. The mice, having consumed the heart of the granary, began to spread through the town, seeking warmth and new larders. They were a tide of desperation. Housewives wept as they found their flour bins infested, their winter stores of potatoes and apples gnawed to ruin. Traps were useless, snapping shut every 5 minutes, a futile gesture against an infinite army. The town was rich and worthless, fouled grain, and starving for a clean loaf of bread. Hunger changes a town. It strips away the easy fat of mockery and leaves the bare bone of need. The whispers about Alara Jansen started again, but this time they were different. They were no longer laced with pity or scorn. They were tinged with a desperate, bewildered curiosity. Her field was small, she kept to herself. The owls, what about the owls? They remembered seeing her and the boy, not playing in filth, but working. They remembered her sealing her small granary. They remembered her quietness not as ignorance, but as something else, something they couldn't name. It was a proud, frightened neighbor, the same one who had told her the ground would only grow heartache, who came first. He didn't come to the front door. He came to the back, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the ground. He looked old and broken. "Miss Jansen," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "My wife. She baked the last of our clean flour this morning. The children. They're hungry." He didn't ask directly. His shame was too great. He just stood there, a testament to the fortune inversion that had gripped the valley. Alara looked at him for a long moment. She saw not the man who had mocked her, but a father afraid for his family. She went into her house and came back with a small sack of flour, enough for a week. She handed it to him. He took it, his hand trembling. "I can pay," he said, fumbling in his pocket. "No," Alara said softly. "You can't." It was not a judgment. It was a fact. His money was worthless if there was no food to buy. He left without another word. His shoulders slumped not in defeat, but in the heavy weight of an unearned kindness. The story of the flour spread faster than the story of the ruined granary. It was a single spark of hope. And so they came. That evening, a crowd of them, their faces illuminated by the flickering, uncertain light of their lanterns. They were a silent mob of need. They stood at her gate, the one that opened onto the lane, the one that had been the boundary between her world and theirs. At their head was Silas Croft. He had regained a sliver of his composure, cloaking his panic in the mantle of civic duty. "Alara," he began, dropping the formal Miss Jansen in an attempt at false intimacy. "The town is in crisis. We know you have a store of grain, a private store. In the interest of the community, for the common good, the town council has authorized me to purchase your surplus." His eyes scanned her property, calculating. He was no longer a merchant. He was a predator, trying to salvage his own reputation by seizing her success. Alara stepped out onto her porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Finn, who had been in the barn, came to stand silently beside her, a small, fierce shadow. She looked past Croft, at the faces of the people who had called her a fool. Their eyes were pleading. She had waited for this moment, though she had not known what it would look like. She had done the arithmetic of survival in the dark, alone. She had counted owl pellets and wheat stalks and the days until winter. Now, here they were, the final sum of all her calculations. The silence on the porch stretched, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the wind in the bare trees and the distant, imagined scratching from the town. Croft shifted his weight, his confidence beginning to fray at the edges. "Alara, this isn't a negotiation," he said, his voice hardening. "People are going hungry. It is your duty to sell. A thing is what it does," Alara said, her voice so quiet they had to strain to hear it. Croft stared at her, uncomprehending. "What? My price," she said, her gaze steady, "is $40 a sack." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was an astronomical price, more than 10 times the rate before the plague. It was the price of a gouger, a profiteer. It was the price they had all secretly feared, the price they perhaps felt they deserved. Croft's face broke into a relieved, predatory smile. This, he understood. Greed was a language he spoke fluently. "Now, Alara, that's absurd," he said, his smooth tone returning. "But I am prepared to be generous. The town will offer you $10 a sack. A handsome profit for you, and a price the town can bear." He was trying to frame himself as the reasonable one, the savior protecting the town from her avarice. He expected her to haggle, to play the game. Alara did not move. My price is $40. For you, Mr. Croft. She let the words hang in the cold air. Then she turned her gaze to the rest of the crowd, to the hungry faces, the worried parents, the shamed farmers. For my neighbors, she said, her voice clear and strong now. The price is $4 a sack. The same price you got for your own grain at the start of the harvest. The reversal was stunning. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. They looked from Alara to Croft, the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't about profit. This was about justice. Croft's face flushed to dark, mottled red. He had been played, exposed. This is ridiculous. You can't. This is price fixing. It's illegal. Is it? Alara asked calmly. It's my grain. I can set whatever price I choose. Or I can choose not to sell at all. The threat was unspoken, but absolute. She held all the cards. She had the food. Croft, desperate, played his last one. You can't possibly have that much grain. Your little field. It's a pittance. Most of it has probably been stolen already. A lone woman like you, he was trying to diminish her, to create doubt. I have 40 sacks, Alara said. Clean, safe, and locked. Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. 40? Impossible. I saw your harvest. And how would you know anyway? I heard from the miller that 5 of your sacks were infested before you even left the mill. It was a clumsy lie, a desperate stab in the dark. But it was the slip she had been waiting for. The final piece of arithmetic. She turned to the miller, who was standing near the back of the crowd, his face pale. Is that true, Mr. Jonas? Did you tell Mr. Croft that 5 of my sacks were infested? The miller shook his head, terrified. No, Miss Jansen. Your grain was the cleanest I've seen all year. I never spoke to Mr. Croft. Alara's eyes locked back onto the grain merchant. Her voice was cold as iron. Then how did you know I had 42 sacks to begin with? The trap snapped shut. The crowd went dead silent. Croft had overplayed his hand, revealing his own thieving calculations, his own private inventory of her property. He knew the count because he had been planning to steal it, or seize it, all along. His condescension, his false concern, it was all a lie to cover his own greed. He stood there, exposed in the lantern light, his authority stripped away by a simple question. He had been outwitted not by cleverness, but by simple, patient truth. Shame is a powerful force in a small town. To be exposed as a fool is one thing. To be exposed as a cheat and a liar in front of everyone you presume to lead is another. Silas Croft did not say another word. He turned, his shoulders stiff, and pushed his way through the crowd that parted for him as if he were a leper. His power and promise was broken. It had been built on the illusion of abundance, and it crumbled in the face of a real, earned scarcity. The moment he was gone, the tension broke. People began to talk, their voices low and humbled. Alara let them talk. She waited. Finally, the farmer who had come to her earlier stepped forward again, his hat in his hands. Miss Jansen, Alara, we'll pay the $4. Gladly, one by one, they formed a line. Finn, his face glowing with pride, stood by the door of the granary with Alara's ledger, marking down the names. Alara herself unlocked the door and, with the help of 2 of the farmers, began to carry out the sacks. They were heavy with the promise of bread, of survival. She did not gloat. She did not lecture. She simply sold her grain at a fair price, the price of a neighbor, not a predator. Being right was its own kind of reply. The arithmetic of generosity was more powerful than the arithmetic of greed. The town of Promise was fed that winter, not on the bounty of a record harvest, but on the meager, precious yield of the most scorned piece of land in the valley. They ate the bread made from Alara's wheat, and it tasted of humility. The dynamic of the town shifted, slowly but irrevocably. The mockery was replaced by a quiet, profound respect. People started leaving things on her porch, a jar of pickled beets, a newly knitted scarf, a bundle of firewood. They weren't payments. They were offerings. They would ask her opinion on the weather, on planting times, on the health of their animals. They had mistaken her stillness for ignorance. Now they saw it as wisdom. They began to see their own land differently, to notice the small economies of nature they had always ignored. A few of the younger farmers even started asking her about the owls. They would see her and Finn walking the fields, their heads bent together over some small discovery, and they would watch with a new understanding. The silo was no longer a symbol of ruin. It was a watchtower. The owls were no longer ghosts. They were guardians. The mouse plague eventually burned itself out, having consumed its own fuel. It left behind a valley poorer in coin, but richer in sense. The next spring, the town did not pour all its effort into a single, vulnerable crop. They diversified. They built better granaries. They learned the hard lesson that wealth is not what you have, but what you can protect. Silas Croft left town before the thaw, his business and his reputation in tatters. No one missed him. The evenings were Alara's favorite time. She would sit on her porch with a cup of tea, and Mrs. Petrova would often walk over and join her. They would watch the sky soften from blue to pink to deep violet. They would watch the flock emerge from the silo. 53 silent hunters, pouring into the twilight to begin their work. More now, actually. There were young ones, their flight still a little clumsy. The population was growing. Finn would be there, too, sitting on the steps, his own small ledger in his lap, proudly tracking the new arrivals. He knew all their names. He was no longer the town's overlooked boy. He was the keeper of the owls, an apprentice in the science of observation. One evening, as the last of the light bled from the sky, Mrs. Petrova patted Alara's hand. Her touch was the same as it had been that first day, a root-strong comfort. "You have good land now," the old woman said. Alara looked out over her fields. The winter wheat was sprouting, a haze of brilliant green against the dark earth. The soil was rich and alive. Her small house was snug and secure. The silo stood dark against the stars, a silent, watchful presence. She was not alone. She was the center of a thriving world she had built herself, out of things others had thrown away. She was secure, vindicated, and at peace. "It was always good land," Alara replied softly, watching as Judge, the big silent owl, landed on the fence post, its head turning in a slow, knowing arc. People just couldn't see it. Mrs. Petrova smiled, a slow, deep smile of satisfaction. She looked from Alara's calm, confident face to the hunting owl and back again. She didn't need to say the words. Alara had learned the lesson by heart. A thing is not what it looks like. A thing is what it does. And in the quiet, breathing dark of the valley, the work was being done. The faint hoot of an owl echoed across the fields, a sound that was no longer a curse, but a blessing. It was the sound of a promise kept.